So I've been at Monticello since late 2008. Monticello, as most people recognize, is one of the premier historic sites in the country. It's the only house in America on the United Nations list of World Heritage Sites. It commands annual visitation of somewhere around 450,000 people a year, which is pretty good for outside an urban area. We're 2 hours from Washington. And at the time that I arrived, a new visitor center was being readied for prime time. We opened it within months of my arrival. It's been a wonderful success. It's certainly driven more visitation and longer visits. And one of the things that characterized the work in the visitor center, which includes a film, exhibits, shop, cafe, the usual suspects, is a greater attention to the story of the enslaved people here. The film particularly is very candid about Jefferson's views, as well as his views on slavery and his ownership of slaves. So sometimes that seems a paradox. In the galleries, we're very open about putting materials, archaeological as well as research materials on enslaved people in the galleries, and we even have the family tree of Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson and their children. So as we looked at the mountain, we got the visitor center open, wildly successful. Now let's bring our attention back to the mountain. Let's bring our attention back to the authenticity of the mountain, the house. Well, Jefferson's house, as most people know, is on top of a mountain. It was carved out by human labor and animal labor to create that plateau. What people may not realize is that 50 yards from Jefferson's bedroom is an area called Mulberry Row. And Mulberry Row is the main street of the Monticello plantation. It may not be obvious to visitors today that the plantation was 5,000 acres. So this was a plantation enterprise of big proportions. And it was operated from Jefferson's office and from Mulberry Row. His closest managers, the enslaved and white servants who worked for him and white workers he employed were all in this locus right below the house. They're coming, they're going, they're conferring, things are happening. So Mulberry Row today is a sleepy little tree-lined lane that looks quite romantic, but in fact, quite the opposite. There are visitors to Monticello who are African American who have been known to say, and have been quoted back to me, our history's been erased. Where are we? There's nothing on the landscape to suggest how important we were to this place. Well, that became really our challenge and our opportunity. And it seemed to all of us on the staff who were involved that the time had come. We know more about plantation slavery at this site than any other plantation in America. And that also became for us a responsibility. If we don't do it, how can we expect other people to do it? We know so much because Jefferson left records, because we've done all this research, because Jefferson was so famous, other people wrote letters and stories, there was narratives. So when you have the best documented plantation in, as far as we know, in America, and you have Thomas Jefferson, who is a lightning rod for the issue of slavery, given the words he wrote in the Declaration, it seemed to us that we needed to take a leadership position and take that story forward. The decision to restore the invisible people at Monticello and the landscape of slavery obviously began with a lot of conversations inside the tent, including our board. I think if you don't have trustees who are ready to take on a topic of that sensitivity and that challenge, then you might want to wait till you do have trustees who are ready to take that on. I can say categorically this board has been phenomenal. They have, to a man or woman, been completely supportive. And that doesn't mean that every one of them welcomed the idea that Monticello was going to distinguish itself in a topic with which they might personally feel a little uncomfortable. In a way, that's why we need to do it. So one of the things we started doing was talking about it at every single board meeting. Here's what we're thinking. What do you think? And as it gained momentum, we keep coming back. Let's take a touch point. Obviously, there were those who were great proponents on the board and began to put money into it, and there were those who were a little quieter about it. But I think one of the things that distinguishes any challenging project is you try to lay it out in a strategic way that gives you some early victories, that gives you some positives to bring everybody else along, the naysayers or the ones who are scared. Oh, it's not so bad. Oh, this is going to be okay. One of the things we did, which I'm not sure I could take credit for having been smart enough to think of it, but it worked out really well, was we started with the house. So instead of coming down on Mulberry Row and trying to put slave cabins back up, which we might not actually do. I mean, we're going to put at least one up, but we don't anticipate putting as much back on the landscape as contextualizing it for people. But what we started was maybe where people were most comfortable, which is the house. And we got the offices out of the upstairs. And we emptied all the rest of the house that still was used for storage and all that and said, you know what? It's time we had tours up here. It's time we talked about who else was in this house. The first floor tour is all about our man, the great man. And in 35, 40 minutes, you have plenty to talk about with Thomas Jefferson without much time to get into who else is making this house work. The minute we started doing what I call the vertical tour, from the cellar to the dome room, you're instantly talking about who's living in those rooms. How does this house function with these tiny staircases? Who's cooking in the kitchen? How is the family interacting with the labor force? And so it also was a great way to drive a different paradigm about our interpretation, which was more about dialogue. So one of the things I asked the guides and the education and the interpretation division to consider is, instead of a 35-minute tour where we talk and expect our visitors to listen, where possible, when it seems appropriate, when your visitors obviously are comfortable and anxious to do so, can we bring more dialogue into these tours? One of the changes we made, which seems quite benign, but actually I think it was part of the transition of attitudes, was changing the name of a tour we had. So the tour of the house is the standby, the one that everyone takes, but we also have some additional tours that you can join outside at no cost. And one is the garden tour a few times a day. Obviously this is in good weather. And the other outdoor tour was for years called the Plantation Community Tour. And as we began to approach the opening of the exhibition in Washington and a much higher national profile of what we were doing here, we looked at each other in a meeting one day and I said, why are we calling that the Plantation Community Tour? Well, I don't think we were, and somebody laughed and said, well, probably, years ago, because the tour had been going on for I don't know how many years, we probably weren't comfortable calling it a tour about slavery. And I said, well, we're calling this show Slavery at Jefferson's Monticello. Can we just rename the tour Slavery at Monticello? Now, this is a really happy story because everybody in the room cheered. The staff knew. That's what the tour's about. Well, so they cheered. I haven't heard any negative feedback on any comment card on any blog. The tour's more popular now than it was. I think people know exactly what it's about. So, along the way, you realize how a ball is rolling and how it's going to change your attitude and open up your eyes. I think the dialogue in the house, we'd have to talk to the guides. But I hear that there are more compliments than ever about how we handle slavery here. We have begun to do an active visitor evaluation program. So we actually now do it by email because we have enough tickets sold through email that we don't do it on site. One of the things we learn, most sites realize, is if I put a microphone in front of you and say, did you like your tour? You're going to say, oh, I love my tour. So we wait till people are home. They've had a little time to decompress. And within 2 weeks, we send them a survey. And we get very, very high marks for taking on challenging topics. Well, there are barriers of resources and there are barriers of attitude. Attitude was easier in the beginning, resources was harder. I was therefore completely thrilled and delighted when one of our trustees, who was born in Germany and who lived in Nazi Germany as a boy, remembers the American soldiers, came to this country 30-some, 40-some years ago, has had a very successful global business, was so moved, he put in place a $3 million challenge grant. matching every dollar up to $3 million to begin to get this thing rolling. And that was huge, I think, in terms of not only my personal commitment, but I thought that really said volumes about how we wanted to approach this project. Attitudes-wise, I would say that it has been very important to make sure that everyone at Monticello doesn't feel like this is all we're focusing on. I think that if this had been a situation where we said, all hands on deck for the next 5 years, we're really going to focus on the slavery question in Mulberry Row, that would have been a tough sell. And so for the donors, as well as for the staff, there are other projects that are important, and in fact, vitally important. Our scholarship, our research, the story of the gardens. We just published a wonderfully successful book about Jefferson's Revolutionary Garden. So we had the bandwidth that we could take this on without it consuming everyone. And in a way, you think about that, that wouldn't be the right perspective either. We needed to keep a balanced perspective for ourselves and for our donors. This past January, we opened what we hoped would be and what I think has become a landmark exhibition on the topic of slavery in the early republic. And it's called Slavery at Jefferson's Monticello, Paradox of Liberty. And it's right there. First thing you see when you walk in the galleries is the desk that is owned by the Smithsonian, the laptop desk on which Jefferson wrote those words that have changed our world. All men are created equal. He wrote the Declaration on that desk. It went through the family, was eventually given to the Smithsonian, and they loaned it for the show in their own museum. And right behind it is a statue of Jefferson, and right behind that is a wall on which every name of every slave he owned is inscribed. It is an incredibly powerful expression of the controversy, the irony, the challenges of slavery. The show has been open since late January. It closes in mid-October. It's drawn record crowds. It has been far more successful than I think we ever dared dream. But it also was a moment of great consternation for us. As we approached that opening, we were very nervous about what the press would say, and what the New York Times would say, and what the Washington Post would say. It's a very tough topic. And my assumption had been that there would be, I hoped, no more than 10% over here who would say, how dare you talk about Jefferson the slaveholder, you're staining his reputation. I thought, I hope it's only 10% over here who say, you haven't really told the full story, you're sugarcoating it, this isn't really what slavery was about, you've really died. And I thought, if we have done our job correctly, the 80% in the middle will feel that we handled it with honesty, with candor, and with the proper perspective. And our goal was not to condemn Jefferson, and it was certainly not to celebrate. It was to be as transparent as we could about what slavery meant at Monticello into the lives of these people. So fast forward, it's January, and Ed Rothstein is coming to do his interviews. He actually does an interview. He looks and generally often doesn't talk to anyone. And what ended up happening in the press was almost universally positive and triumphant. Ed's article in the New York Times was just so laudatory, and laudatory of what we were doing on Mulberry Row as well. He came here. The Washington Post followed suit. I mean, I actually don't remember the 10% at either side happening, and I'm sure maybe somebody found an article somewhere. But there was such a wave of positive reaction to what we did that it was just tremendously gratifying. And it was so well deserved by all the people at Monticello who had worked so hard on this research for so many years. So that wave of public support and adulation, the millions, I think there have probably been over 1 million people who have seen that show before it closes, and their response, and the purchase of the book that went, I mean, there's just been so much great reception for the topic that I think it's made the topic easier for everybody out there, or at least that would be my hope. If I had it to do over again, I might start with the descendants themselves. We involved them. They'd been part of our research for 20, 30 years. I now have a greater I realized one of my own fears and blind spots perhaps was, and I'm not sure I knew this till you asked the question, was facing them with a Monticello that didn't have their story. And so we went about making sure we were bringing that story forward. But having more contact with them as this has happened has, yeah, if I had it to over again with what I know now, I think maybe I would have invited them all to Monticello first. I think it would have given me more insight into how they viewed Monticello, but I also think it would have given us more ambassadorship into the nation. One of the stories that the exhibition tells, which was not necessarily anticipated, is that the descendants of Monticello slaves were disproportionately involved in the civil rights movement all the way along. So what does that tell us? I mean, it's anecdotal, it's qualitative research, but we certainly don't have statistics on everybody else from every other plantation. But they're just Tuskegee Airmen. They're obviously in the Civil War on the northern side. They're in the Niagara movement. They're some of the first people to, the first African American in the state legislature in California is a descendant of one of Monticello's slave families. I mean, over and over and over, you begin to see they took the concept of liberty with them. They were not deaf to the fact that they came from a place that put out a dream for the world that had not yet happened for them.